All right, we're all set.
Excellent. Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. Julie Moore, Secretary of Natural Resources, and I'm joined this morning by ANR's General Counsel, Catherine Guessing. And our plan for the next little bit here is to kind of give you an overview of how we've gotten to where we currently sit in terms of developing a corrective action plan for EPA around concerns that have been raised related to our regulation of CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations, and talk about sort of next steps in that process. So starting with a little bit of background and context, as you probably know, the Conservation Law Foundation, along with VNRC and the Lake Champlain Committee, filed what is called a de-delegation petition with EPA in 2022. And it essentially indicated or asserted their belief that the agency was not fulfilling its obligations under the Clean Water Act when it came to regulating Vermont farms, and asked EPA to review the deficiencies they identified and potentially de-delegate Vermont, which would mean we would no longer have an ability to issue any discharge permits, not just for farms, but also to wastewater facilities and for stormwater discharges, and that all of that work, if we couldn't satisfactorily resolve the concerns, would be returned to EPA Region 1 in Boston. EPA spent roughly the next 2 years doing their own review of the materials that were submitted by the petitioners. They looked at files. They even conducted some of their own farm inspections. And then in the summer of 24 began what they termed settlement negotiations. So brought the petitioners, ANR, together along with them to talk about what would need to be part of a corrective action plan to try to resolve the petition and leave ANR with the ability to continue to issue Clean Water Act permits. In September 2024, we received a letter from EPA with a very specific set of directives that I will walk you through. And then over the last several months, we've engaged in a back and forth in trying to kind of flesh out that corrective action plan and ensure that we are addressing the deficiencies that EPA has identified in our work and have a credible path forward that allows us to retain the authority to issue permits under the Clean Water Act.
Representative O'Brien, question.
Secretary, so was there a point when the EPA did some investigation and said, yep, ANR is not doing their job?
Yeah, they did confirm that I don't know that they agreed with all of the deficiencies identified by the petitioners, but found that there are deficiencies in our program. So in their September 2024 letter, which was sort of the first documentation we had from them of their concerns, these were sort of the key things that they identified. That ANR has to be the lead inspector on all potentially jurisdictional farms. Currently, the Ag Agency sends out 2 inspectors for medium and large farm inspections. ANR has the ability to join them. But we're not necessarily the lead inspector, and EPA indicated that is a change that needs to happen. In addition, ANR must be reviewing nutrient management plans for those farms that we're going to inspect. Farms are developing nutrient management plans. The Ag Agency does have the ability and does review them, but was made clear that ANR needs to be part of that as well. We have to have a system for tracking, permitting, and monitoring actions. We need to be taking enforcement actions against farms that discharge without a permit. There were a number of concerns raised around personnel within ANR. Currently, we have 2 staff dedicated to our CAFO program, and EPA has been very clear that they don't believe that is sufficient. We don't have perfect alignment with current Federal Clean Water Act requirements related to CAFOs, so a little bit of true up, and that's part of what's in the bill that's in front of you right now. And then proposing a timeline, recognizing this isn't just flip a switch and ANR is going to start to engage fully in ag water quality regulation, that there's groundwork that needs to be done, and so asked us to propose a timeline. So then in December, we were given 90 days to respond to that initial letter from EPA. We submitted a draft corrective action plan. This corrective action plan was developed in consultation with the Ag Agency and really focused on aligning water quality regulation on farms with Federal Clean Water Act requirements. That's important because the Ag Agency regulatory programs go beyond just water quality regulation, particularly for large farms. They are looking at things like traffic and odors and vectors. Those aren't Clean Water Act concerns, and this is really a Clean Water Act question. We established a 4-year implementation timeframe to sort of get fully up to meeting what we understand to be EPA's expectations. And some of the key components, including defining clearly the roles, responsibilities of and authorities of ANR versus the Ag Agency, including that ANR is going to lead on these joint inspections with a commitment to do at least 10 inspections of medium and large farms this coming summer. And that those farms would be selected with input from EPA based on concerns they identified through file review and their own on-the-ground work. That we will be taking the lead in determining if a farm needs a CAFO permit, which means that a point source discharge was found. And also requiring CAFO permits if a farm is not following its nutrient management plan. The Ag Agency will continue to regulate farms that don't need a CAFO permit through their existing LFO, MFO, and SFO program. The Ag Agency has a very robust data management system that I assume this committee is seeing presentations from in terms of tracking farm inspection data. We're going to kind of bolt on our own access to the same data management system. So all farm records will be in one comprehensive spot, and there is funding in the governor's FY26 recommended budget to support that IT project. Made clear we will review nutrient management plans prior to engaging in farm inspections, and farms that are subject to CAFO permits, those nutrient management plans will also need to be subject to public notice. We are going to update our CAFO rule, our medium farm CAFO general permit, and other related forms in order to get ready for this. So we match current federal Clean Water Act requirements. That we will file an annual report with EPA showing our progress towards the 4-year timeline and ultimately fulfilling the obligations they've identified. And that we are moving to convert an existing position to be in our CAFO program. The governor's budget recommend also included 2 new positions to support CAFO work. So it'll bring that program total to 5. And then we had said to EPA, because they had a lot of questions about staffing, that in December of 2026, we would report back on additional staff and resource needs if necessary. Once we have engaged in 2 summers worth of inspections and have a better sense how many Vermont farms likely require CAFO permits.
There's been, I'll just back up and say that our committee in the House supported the additional funding for both the data that you mentioned and then these 2 positions. I know there has been conversation, not necessarily in this room, about whether the addition of 2 positions in your agency ought to translate to 2 fewer positions in the Ag Agency, under the thought, I guess, that there's not additional work being done, but just a shift in the work. And this is probably a question maybe I will also ask to the Ag Agency, but if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I think at least in this transition period, I'm not sure that it actually results in a significant reduction in the work being required at the Ag Agency. In part, there are requirements for particularly large farms that sit wholly outside the CAFO program that Ag will continue to have to administer. And it doesn't change that they need to be involved in the same nutrient management plan review that we will be conducting, because they're also going to be inspecting farms, and to the extent the farm isn't pulled off to obtain CAFO permit coverage, it would need to move forward under the Ag Agency's regulatory authority. Long term, that may be a different set of circumstances, but in the short term, I think this model makes the most sense. So we submitted our corrective action plan in early January. EPA then responded, and my 2-sentence summary of their response would be, this is directionally correct and we need more detail. And so that's really what we worked to do as we prepared our next redraft of our corrective action plan that was submitted in January. I don't necessarily need to read all of these things, but you get the sense, right? A lot of clarified, commit, explain. Those are just the places that they felt we didn't have enough detail in our original draft corrective action plan. What we submitted in March, I sent into Sidonia this morning, so you all should have it if you would like to thumb through it. But it does contain that additional detail. Provides more specifics about how we're going to separate those roles and responsibilities between ANR and the Ag Agency, confirms that ANR has the sole authority to make determinations about what farms may require a CAFO permit, gets into inspection priorities and timelines, and we provided EPA with what was then the current draft of, I think, S100, but has become S124. For their review. And just a few words about the importance of that language to EPA is it really does demonstrate our commitment to implementing the corrective action plan, because it makes a set of initial conforming changes in Title 10. I think that word initial is important. I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that this may be all the changes that are required, but these are the changes that are required to get started on this work. It also lays out some pretty clear directives for a robust stakeholder process that I see as integral to making sure we're hearing from farmers and creating a regulatory structure that provides certainty and within which they can be successful. And on April 1st, and that was also included in what I submitted this morning, EPA did issue a letter that was generally supportive of the legislation for those reasons.
Yeah, that letter is on our website too, so we can review that.
And then just where we're headed from here, and then happy to answer questions you may have, is we're working to finalize that corrective action plan, and hopeful that that'll occur in fairly short order here. Once we have sort of final clarity and make sure we understand exactly what the General Assembly's interests are in the agricultural stakeholder engagement in addition to ours, we'll initiate that process and know that the farmer watershed groups have already put together a team of stakeholders that are committed to participating in this process, which I think is really important. Work is beginning internally on drafting revised roles and responsibilities. I think that this is probably something that won't be finalized till after we have the ability to talk with the stakeholder group too. But ultimately, those roles and responsibilities will have opportunity for public notice and comment, and also are subject to EPA approval. Staff are beginning the revisions necessary to issue a CAFO general permit that would cover all farm sizes. Currently, it's really a medium farm CAFO general permit. We anticipate there could be large farms that might be able to obtain general permit coverage, and certainly maybe some small farms that necessitate general permit coverage if they're having active discharges. And then we'll be working on those 10 farm inspections this coming field season.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Secretary Moore. The inspections, we have LFO. And typically in our inspection, there is someone there from ANR, maybe not in charge of the inspection, but certainly in charge of the situation. How many other farms, LFOs have you sent out your people on with the Agency of Agriculture to do inspections? Because they've been at ours, but if not every time, almost every time.
I would say for large farms, most,
Yeah.
maybe not every year, although large farms are inspected by the ag agency, as you know, every year. But we do try to attend those inspections to the extent possible. Medium farms is another story, and we haven't been very active in participating in medium farm inspections, and that is something that EPA flagged as a deficiency in
Okay.
our work.
All right, so you haven't been involved though in the inspections.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But also, the reviewing the nutrient management plan in depth before participating in the inspection was another deficiency EPA had flagged.
Yeah, our farm's is that thick.
Correct. No, I know those documents are really substantial and evolving over time.
Yeah. Yeah, they're very expensive to get every year.
Understood.
Representative O'Brien?
Julie, going forward, will farms, does it make sense for them in some ways to just farming strategy wise to say, we're gonna go with a CAFO general permit, or we might want to stick with being an MFO?
I mean, I think that probably depends on the individual farmer, right? And appreciating regulatory certainty has real value. Farmers may wish to become a CAFO because it will give them certainty, as opposed to every time an inspection occurs, there could be a chance that it would be determined that they need CAFO permit coverage. But that decision making, to the extent a farm doesn't have any discharges, is really left to the discretion of the farmer under this model.
Can you maybe talk a little bit then, Secretary Moore, about what it means to have a CAFO permit? So from the perspective of the farmer, so I guess maybe from the perspective of a member of the public, thinking about what does a permit allow somebody to do?
Sure.
It sounds like, I think of a building permit. I need that in order to build, and I have to pay for it, and then maybe there's some other steps I have to take, but then I can go ahead and do what I want, what I'm planning to do. Would having a CAFO permit allow a farm to discharge, or is it saying you've been given this permit, you need to stop discharging?
So I think first, the ag agency's permits are no discharge permits, whereas Clean Water Act permit is a discharge permit. In the case of CAFOs, it allows for discharges under a very limited set of circumstance. Generally, it's if rainfall exceeds the 25-year, 24-hour storm, which is in the neighborhood of 3 inches of rainfall. Felt like a lot, maybe prior to the last 2 summers. But so it does have an allowance for discharges that occur during extreme weather that does not exist in the ag agency's regulatory framework. The other piece, and this was one of the deficiencies ag identified, is so you have these no discharge permits. There are clearly records that show farms that have had discharges that weren't immediately able to be permanently corrected, right? That required some amount of time or construction or something in order to address. The Clean Water Act doesn't provide a window to come into compliance. If a farm has a discharge that can't be immediately corrected, they need to have a CAFO permit. And that was part of what EPA said. We have evidence that those discharges exist, and yet you've not issued any CAFO permits. So a big piece of that is a compliance schedule then, right? Recognizing some of these things do require work and resources to be able to actually fully address. We negotiate those compliance schedules. And an example I've used in other settings is it's very similar to how we manage combined sewer systems. Obviously, we don't want to have combined sewer overflows. Each of the communities that has a combined sewer system has worked with us on what we call a long-term control plan, and it's got milestones and timeline associated with it. And as long as they are continuing to make that progress they committed to, they are covered by that permit for discharges that may occur in the interim. If folks don't hold up, if municipalities aren't meeting their obligations under their compliance schedule, that's when enforcement kicks in. But it is trying to have that agreed to approach for addressing concerns that's then documented in that regulatory structure. And so to the extent we identify discharges that are problematic in an inspection, farms would be required to obtain CAFO permit coverage, and we would also be looking to negotiate a compliance schedule for addressing the concern.
It's not that the CAFO permit coverage doesn't give you indefinite permission.
Correct. Only for extreme weather events. That is a permanent sort of protection. We sometimes refer to that as permit as a shield. So if there was an extreme weather event, there was a discharge, the farm would be held harmless, and then it creates this compliance schedule for other things that need to be corrected.
Thank you, Representative O'Brien.
Just to follow up on the chair's question, if you or either, you have to do it or you decide you want to do it as a farmer to get the CAFO general permit, are you eligible then for grants for remedial work that you maybe wouldn't be eligible for now, whether it's EPA or NRCS or whoever?
In general, farms I don't see that there would be any changes in their ability to access technical and financial assistance programs. I think that that's a really important point, and I glossed over it, which is currently the Ag Agency is kind of the lead in all technical and financial assistance, whether it's their best management practices program, their farm agronomic practices program. There is nothing contemplated in our corrective action plan that would change the Ag Agency's leadership role when it comes to technical and financial assistance to help farms comply with these regulatory requirements.
And access to.
Correct. So yeah, we anticipate the same dollars will continue to be available.
We may hear from farmers with concerns. We may hear offline, or we may have farmers who want to come in and testify. Have you heard any during the process, any concerns that you want to speak to now that might be helpful for farmers to know?
Sure. So we have met with a number of farm organizations as we've been working through the corrective action plan. We've met with the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, which is largely farmers from Addison and Chittenden counties. We've met with the Farmers Watershed Alliance, which is largely Franklin County farmers. We had a joint meeting with both of those organizations, as well as the Connecticut River Valley Farmers, I think, or at least Connecticut River Farmers Association, Connecticut Watershed Farmers Association, maybe, is that correct? And we also, within the last week, met with the Vermont Dairy Producers Alliance. And, I think obviously this is new. And so there are concerns about what it means. I would say there were a number of questions about what it means, very much aligned with what you were just saying, Representative Nelson, about what it means to have a nutrient management plan available for public review and inspection, and sort of, are there sideboards on that, or can people get way into the details? Is any of it considered confidential business information that shouldn't be broadly available to the public? So those are, other states have CAFO programs, and we'll be looking to how they have approached those issues to make sure we're managing folks' business information appropriately. Questions about how this will fit together with the LFO and MFO program. So particularly for large farms, recognizing that large farm permits issued by Ag do touch on those traffic and odor and vector concerns. How do you have sort of two regulators and make sure that their work knits together and doesn't have farmers in the position of receiving competing direction? Can appreciate that. We have that sometimes within A&R, where our stormwater program may give advice that's different than our wetlands program, that's different than our rivers program. And hear a lot from the regulated community that we're happy to do what you want, but you need to give us one answer. And I think farmers are concerned about how those pieces are going to line up and fit together. To me, that stakeholder engagement process is going to be really critical, both in helping answer those questions, and then also look at if there are changes we should be making to ensure the kind of alignment that I think is reasonable to ask from regulatory agencies.
Thank you for that. I know Representative Lipsky had asked a question earlier this morning about something maybe related.
There was a lot of discussion about, under the definition, waters of the state of Vermont. And I recall, this had to do with agriculture. A year ago, there was testimony if there was a point source, whether it was a ditch that flowed. And it included wetlands in, that would be a violation if that ditch went into a wetland, but there was no, one nowhere wetlands figure in the EPA under at this agriculture, because wetlands for AMPs for forestry operations are highly important ecological
Yes.
systems and
Yes.
protected. So it really was. Do you understand the genesis of my
Yes.
inquiry? Thank you.
Yes, and may have Catherine, I'll start and then pitch it to Catherine to help. So there are two different definitions for waters right now, right? There's waters of the US and then there's waters of the state. And waters of the state is both somewhat more expansive than waters of the US and frankly more stable in that waters of the US has been all over the place over the last several administrations. My understanding is that EPA is currently taking another look at the definition of waters of the US in light of the most recent Supreme Court decision. So it may move yet again. There is some wetlands are contained within waters of the US, but not as many as are contained within waters of the state. And maybe Catherine, ask you to weigh in here and help clarify a little.
Sure, there's federal case law which requires there to be an obvious hydrological connection between wetlands and waters of the US. And so that definition is potentially much narrower than the state law. And I do believe that the EPA will be looking at refining that definition so that it's consistent with some of the case law out there.
It's helpful.
Representative O'Brien, did you have a hand up earlier?
Yeah, just, would all this fall under DEC?
Yes.
Okay, so as far as, I mean, I'm just thinking of other areas of farming, like sugaring example, is that an FPR? Like what happens with water in forest operations?
So in forestry operations, it's the accepted management practices. So it's a set of BMPs, and when loggers are complying with those BMPs, they are considered to be in compliance with the Vermont water quality standards. Sugaring operations is a little bit different generally. Well, first I should say, to the extent folks are just boiling off sap, no, there isn't really a discharge. To the extent sugaring operations have become more reliant on reverse osmosis systems and do end up, the water component tends to not be a problem. It's generally clean, but then there is, I'm not going to remember the term, but there's sort of the sludgier component of what is generated. And we have by and large worked with sugar producers to capture that more concentrated waste and then essentially dispose of it the same way septic is disposed of, where it's hauled to a wastewater treatment facility. But that's really the very large maple sugar operations where that comes into effect, and they are subject then to our waste disposal rules.
And if I was a farmer with 1,000 acres in Madison County of tiled field but had no animals, then where do I fall?
So tile drains are not considered point sources and so aren't subject to Clean Water Act regulation.
And to be a CAFO, you really have to have animals.
You do. I mean, really, the CAPO permit is focused on the barnyard. If you were a crop farmer and applying nutrients and weren't doing it in a manner consistent with a nutrient management plan, I still don't know that that could trigger a CAFO requirement because really the threshold is animal units.
That production area.
Correct.
No, Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Secretary Moore, I've heard from a lot of my colleagues that would like this law to mirror New York's law. And, speaking to Ledge Council yesterday, Council O'Grady, he said that, the TMDL for New York and Lake Champlain is vastly different than Vermont, which kind of surprised me. I didn't know the Osable and the Shazy had less carrying capacity than the Missisquoi or the.
Yeah.
And they run through similar aspects of land. Why would that be?
So, in 1990, I may be wrong. No, I think it was 1998. CLF appealed the EPA's sort of approval of the Lake Champlain TMDL. They only appealed that decision, the decision that was made by EPA Region 1, so it only affects Vermont. New York is actually part of EPA Region 2, so it's a little weird in that we have a shared water body, but two different EPA regions. And at that time, New York and EPA Region 2 were not interested in participating in the work we were going to need to do to revise our implementation plan. And so we had an agreement we reached in the early 90s with New York about how to allocate load and how to, I completely gave you the wrong date. It wasn't 1998. It may have been 2008. So my apologies. But we had an agreement from the 90s, New York, Vermont, and Quebec with how we were going to kind of allocate the phosphorus reductions that were necessary to achieve water quality standards in the lake. Our portion of the TMDL was appealed. New York wasn't, and they are just following the course they had charted for themselves in the mid-90s. We ultimately saw a revised TMDL for Vermont adopted in 2016, and that is what we have been working from ever since. It does require really significant nutrient reductions from all sectors, including agriculture. And so a lot of that is on the field practices side and nutrient management plan as opposed to barnyards. You know, to me, the farmsteads are in some ways the wastewater treatment plants of the ag space where it's a relatively small proportion of the phosphorus pollution load. But then thinking about the land base associated with those operations becomes really important. And so we are subject to a different set of obligations than our counterparts in New York.
So in other words, New York's over in the next room, peeking around the corner and saying, nothing to see here.
Well, they are a better partner than that. We all participate robustly through the Lake Champlain Basin program. So Vermont, New York, and Quebec are meeting quarterly, reviewing progress, sharing strategies and successes as well as failures so we can learn from one another and trying to keep ourselves generally aligned.
Another question. Would there ever be appetite? Another thing I hear from my colleagues is the spreading ban, December 1st to April, December 15th to April 1st. Now, up in my part of the world, it doesn't really matter because snow comes and stays. But in Connecticut, lower Connecticut, River Valley, parts of the Lake Champlain Valley, you may not have winter conditions. Maybe all winter or maybe just for 6 weeks in the winter. would there ever be appetite to allow for a rigorous, I don't know if rigorous is the right idea, not, well, to allow them to apply mineral, like through direct injection, not over the top, but knifed into the ground where it's stable.
I expect that will be a subject of considerable discussion in the
Oh.
stakeholder process. I
Yeah.
know farmers have expressed real interest in what additional flexibilities, if any, might be able to be provided.
Because we do have new technology since these first rules were made. I mean, great advances have been made and more work is being done on phosphorus removal from
Yes.
our product.
Yes, no, understood. And there's nothing in a CAPO program that explicitly requires a winter manure spreading ban. Clearly, New York has a CAPO permit structure that doesn't. And I know the farmers have indicated significant interest in understanding if there's any additional flexibility that might be made available.
Thank you.
Just to that, follow up to that question, then are the practices as far as spreading in New York considerably different than in Vermont?
Big picture, I would say no. Largely manure spreading is governed by a 590 standard nutrient management plan. 590 standard refers to the practice that USDA NRCS has established. So it's a national level standard. There's state-specific modifications that can be added to it, but that the kind of foundation of it is similar across the country. I think the way New York manages winter manure spreading is farmers identify sort of low-risk fields or low-risk areas that are removed from surface waters that have much wider buffers than maybe they would use during the growing season, that tend to have low or no slope, and allows for limited applications during the winter on those fields. They're not without risk, and I point taken that there's also technology that exists now that wasn't available 20 or 25 years ago when the winter manure spreading ban was put in place.
And one more, the P index. Our P index, Cornell is doing, New York operates, I believe, on a different phosphorus index. And Cornell is doing a lot of work in that right now. Our agencies over here open to looking at what Cornell is developing.
I am well out over my skis in trying to answer that question, but I can't imagine we wouldn't be interested in at least the opportunity to review what Cornell is
Okay.
doing and how that might work in Vermont.
Well, as my colleague kitty corner to me says, well, Cornell says neonics are no good, so Cornell says the P index ought to be different.
What?
Might be a good place to wrap.
Field trip.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Secretary Moore?
No, that was my presentation, so appreciate your time this morning.
And Catherine, thank you for being with us as well there. We are, as I said, we are going to take testimony from the Ag Agency. There are a couple of things in the bill that are not specific to the EPA concern. You may want to just, and one of them involves this spreading, an exemption. So we will talk a little bit more about that. There has been at least one of the requests for testimony on the bill from an organization, and we may get more. So I mentioned that time is of the essence. We're not only looking at when are we likely to adjourn, but typically the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committees don't continue to meet past a certain date. I'm also just going to say, and I'll say it on the record, that we didn't get this bill until a week ago, well after crossover date. And normally a Senate bill that arrived in the middle of April or the end of April there when we came back in January. So I'm hopeful that if we need to spend more time on the bill, then we might, ideally, that the Senate will be understanding and that they will, accommodate the fact that we've gotten the bill as late as we did. In case you're wondering, I didn't know this myself, but in our rules allow the speaker to take a bill that comes in after crossover and assign it to a committee at her discretion, at the speaker's discretion. So this is obviously a bill that's important enough that she said it's the only time she's ever done it. So that's how we want to be mindful of that.
And say the bill does not move for whatever reason, what happens?
So I think it complicates our ability to meet sort of the year one commitments we've made in the corrective action plan. We can continue to make forward progress, but some of the sort of conforming changes to Title 10 will complicate our ability to adopt those different definitions into rules. So appreciate in advance your attention to this bill and anything you can do to help us get it across the finish line this year.
Thank you for working with everybody that you've worked with. I know the process you and Ag have been going through on this.
Yes, you're welcome.
Are we, Sidonia, back at 2 possibly? We have a witness who's coming in after the floor. It's going to be an hour-ish, I think. So unless you hear otherwise, come back 10 minutes after the floor, even if you don't hear it.
You think it'll be short?
Shouldn't be too long. Yeah.